Greetings, intrepid system failure listeners. It is time for the System Failure Podcast, and I do believe this is number 88, if I have my numbers right, Brian?
Yes.
All right. Well, it is it's a Mother's Day Sunday here. We have our Mother's Day celebration next week, owing to scheduling conflicts, but that's pretty exciting. Usually, Mother's Day is a sure sign that spring is in the air, and we've broken out of I know you hate talking about the weather, Brian, but we have broken out of one hell of a weather pattern of just constant rain and chilly, raw, cold air.
And to be fair, we didn't tell our mom to take a back seat just so we could record the podcast.
Yeah, no, other scheduling conflicts unrelated to this August podcast. Yeah. Great point of order, Brian. I hadn't thought of that.
But it is, it's been raining every single goddamn day, and the sun is actually out today, and I can scarcely believe it.
Yeah, it's awesome. It feels like... it does feel very springy, very appropriate weather for a Mother's Day. So, man, we've got a jam-packed show. I just, we like to keep when we have our podcast of the week, I try to keep it to 4 or 5, maybe 6 clips at tops. But last week with Catherine Fitz, and now this week with American Alchemy, we have just had red meat thrown to the system failure lions. I mean, these are just electrifying podcasts that so closely match what we talk about here every week on System Failure. I just had to put together no fewer than 8 clips for this week, so we're going to have to get into it in the first half. Before we do that, I have a quote from Will and Ariel Durant about the Kaaba, the mythical, well, not mythical, the black cube that is the central holy artifact of Islam. So that'll be fun to read. But before we get into that, Brian, you've got a few items for us today, have you not?
I just want to say that I went to this Palace Diner in Biddeford yesterday. Have you ever been to the Palace Diner?
The Palace Diner in Biddeford. I feel like maybe I've heard the name before. Like, why is it significant? I cannot imagine why you're bringing this up.
Well,
this will be good.
It's just one of these institutions, man. I mean, it is like a little, boxcar diner. It's just like one row of seating on the counter. And, they only accept cash. And the ATM outside does charge $4.
Yeah, you get an STD on your ATM card sticking in that nefarious slot.
But I don't know, man. Like, the food's incredible. They got flapjacks and banana bread and I don't know tuna melts and I got the breakfast with the flapjacks. Anyway, it's just real food, man. It was incredible. Like, I'm never like. Well, the thing about the lumberjack breakfast is it comes with 5 of these pancakes, and I'm never full after eating. It was just a slog to get through these pancakes.
Wow. So I just feel like pancakes are maybe the lowest tier of the breakfast pastries. There's the triumvirate of French toast, pancakes and waffles, and I feel like French toast is the creme de la creme, the top of the pyramid. The waffles, they can be hit or miss. You can have great waffles, or you can have horrific waffles. I feel like pancakes bring up the rear. Now, if you have a delicious blueberry pancake, I'll admit that that's a good breakfast. I'm just talking about from a sheer batting average perspective. I just feel like the French toast holds its own, and the pancakes are more often than not mealy, or not mealy, but grainy. They're just it's just a pastry.
Well, okay, the problem with French toast, though, is you're using store-bought bread, and it's probably not a fresh thing. It's probably some shelf-stable bread with all kind of
That's a good point. Shelf-stable is deeply concerning.
And so pancakes are usually at least made fresh if they're made out of, Bisquick, although I would admit that that's basically not worth eating. I don't know. I guess I'm not super high on any of them unless they're good.
Yeah. Well, the pancakes that have the pockets of molten Maine blueberries in them, those are really hard to top. And if you put a nice pat of butter on top and some of that Vermont, Maine, or Canadian maple syrup, oh man, it's off the chain. It has to be real maple syrup too, not the I reckon if I wanted to get Aunt Jemima's syrup, you could just pour Coca-Cola into a big pot and boil it down. After a couple hours, you'd probably get the corn syrup or whatever it is, whatever industrial byproduct they're serving up as Aunt Jemima's. So it's got to be that real maple syrup that was once actually located within a maple tree.
They do have the real maple syrup there. Although to be fair, all the diners here in Maine, or at least the major institutions like Becky's here in Portland, nothing finite. Maybe you've seen the bumper stickers or the Miss Portland or this place as well. Anyway, I don't know. It was legit.
All right.
Having a good breakfast was nice.
Anymore, usually going out to eat in any of its shapes or forms is a disaster, and you walk away feeling used and abused. So it's nice when you can have an experience going out to eat that's not just a total hosing.
Did you get a new LL Bean flannel? Is that what's going on?
I did, yeah. See, the issue I'm at a terrible crossroads. My much beloved 1933 signature LL Bean chamois shirt has gotten holes in the elbows from too much use.
Oh no.
But they don't have the pattern I like anymore, so I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do about that. You see, I can take it to, what I can do is return the flannel that has the holes in the elbow, and then buy a whole new flannel, which that's what this is. Or I can like go to the store and pay to have, patches put on the elbows, and keep it going. But then I can't return it anymore. So like the thriftier, like the smart financial move is to return it. But I just love it so much.
Well, the patches would be classy and probably preclude the necessity of returning it, at least for a little while, huh?
Yeah, it would probably last a few more years. Then I would still be in the same ballpark when it finally runs out. So I don't know. Should I pay to It's not very thrifty of me to pay to repair a shirt that you can return for a warranty return. So I don't. I'm wearing this new LL Bean flannel around, trying to find out if I could possibly replace my old beloved one with it. Early indications are I cannot.
I see you've forgotten your usual system failure wardrobe of the LL Bean fisherman's sweater.
Yes. Well, I usually buy everything I possibly can at Beans for these return purposes, but it's starting to get warmer, Brian. With the warm weather here, I did have to swap out the cotton fisherman sweater for a little bit lighter flannel today. It was kind of nice to put away some of those winter clothes. So, but if it's cold next weekend, I'm bringing it back.
All right, cool. Well, what's going on with William and Ariel Durant this week?
Well,
did we tease the black cube thing already?
Yes, we did. The black cube. I guess I'm reading the Age of Faith, which is the Durant's account of medieval society from the fall of Rome right up until the Renaissance, and they're getting into Islamic culture, Muslim culture. Obviously, when the Roman Empire disappeared, when Roman civilization vanished from the Italian peninsula during the fall of Rome, you still had the Eastern Roman Empire centered in Constantinople, and perhaps the most well-known of all the Byzantine emperors is Justinian, who was the most prominent emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. He lived till about 565, I think, when his reign ended, and 5 years later, this man Muhammad was born in Medina, in Saudi Arabia. Of course, he became the prophet who founded Islam. And we don't have to get into the full story of Islam. One of these days, I'm going to have to bring someone who is Muslim onto this podcast and have them explain to us the backgrounds of their faith, and the history behind it, because it's absolutely awesome. But we're not going to get into all that today because we got way too much to get into with respect to the podcast of the week. So I'm just going to read a description by the Durants of the central object of worship in Islam, this Kaaba, which is I guess a meteorite that fell in the desert, thousands of years before the Prophet and before Islam, and it's still when Muslims go on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca every year, this is the object which they circumambulate, that is to circumambulate, which is to say they walk in circles around it, and kiss the stone. But it's a black cube, which I'll read the quote and then we'll talk about the esoteric significance of the black cube.
Well, this black cube is fascinating business. I am keen to hear what Will and Ariel Durant have to say about it.
Okay, well, here is their quote. So this black stone is called the Kaaba. Kaaba is how you'd spell that. Kaaba means a square structure and is one with our word cube. All right, Kaaba, cube. It is the belief of Orthodox Muslims. The Kaaba was built or rebuilt 10 times. The first was erected at the dawn of history by angels from heaven, the second by Adam, the third by his son Seth, the fourth by Abraham and his son Ishmael by Hagar, the seventh by Qusay, chief of the Quraysh tribe, the eighth by the Quraysh leaders in Muhammad's lifetime, 605, and the 9th and 10th by Muslim leaders in 681 and 696. The 10th is substantially the Kaaba of today. It stands near the center of a large porticoed enclosure, the Masjid al-Haram, or Sacred Mosque. It is a rectangular stone edifice, 40 feet long, 35 wide, 50 high. In its southeast corner, 5 feet from the ground, just right for kissing, is embedded the black stone of dark red material, oval in shape, some 7 inches in diameter. Many of its worshippers believe that this stone was sent down from heaven, and perhaps it was a meteorite. Most of them believe that it has been a part of the Kaaba since Abraham. Muslim scholars interpret it as symbolizing that part of Abraham's progeny, Ishmael and his offspring, which, rejected by Israel, became, they think, the founders of the Quraysh tribe. They apply it to a passage from Psalm 28, which is Psalm chapter 22, verse 3. Quote, "The stone which the builders rejected is become the head of the corner. This is Yahweh's doing." Unquote. And another from Matthew 21, in which Jesus, having quoted these strange words, adds, quote, "Therefore the kingdom of God shall be taken away from you and shall be given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof," unquote. Through the virile Muslims, though the virile Muslims would hardly claim to have fulfilled the ethics of Christ. So yeah, the Kaaba is this black stone that is at the center of the Muslim holy pilgrimage, the Hajj. Now, why would we bring this up? Why would we bring up a black cube that's at the heart of Muslim observances? Well, the black cube is this powerful esoteric symbol, right? Prior to Islam, the Kaaba, there was a handful of gods worshipped at the Kaaba. It was a polytheistic scene. One of these was called Allah, and this would be the god that Muhammad would say is the only god, and we're going to get rid of the other gods worshipped at the Kaaba. This in the 7th century, and so you just see that like the black cube becomes this. The heart of at the heart of esoteric or magic symbolism. It's also a prominent symbol in Judaism. There are certain sects of Judaism which wear the black cube as a head on their head or in other parts or on their elbows, other parts of their uniform. Oftentimes these black cubes are hollow and have prayers rolled up and stuck inside. But the thing about the black cube that's really interesting, of course, is that in the late 70s, when NASA sent the Voyager spacecraft out of the solar system and had it complete some flybys of the major gas giants on its way out, took a bunch of pictures of Saturn, and when it did, NASA scientists were shocked to discover the black hexagram etched on the North Pole of Saturn. If you all have not heard of the black hexagram on the North Pole of Saturn, check out a picture on the internet. It's huge, and it looks like a big storm, but it's very strange that a storm would be shaped hexagonally and not some kind of a circle or like a hurricane pattern. And this is like odd. It's odd to find an old occult symbol, etched on the surface of a planet. It's a strange symbol, and it was eerily preceded by the idea of the obelisks in the 1969 movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. You may recall this film, Brian. We talked about it a lot on this podcast. In that film, the obelisk is not found on Saturn, the mystical object that propels humanity onto its voyage of constant technological improvement. All right, the obelisk in the movie, obviously there's a famous scene where a bunch of prehistorical apes are confronted by the obelisk, and then the movie cuts to another obelisk being discovered on the moon in the near future, and then a third obelisk being discovered on one of the moons of Jupiter. So it's interesting that 10 years after this movie came out, they found a black hexagram on the North Pole of Saturn. So before we explain...
it just in the movie also, the obelisk is supposed to be like this harbinger of technology, or this thing which develops the apes so that they start using weaponry and smashing the rival ape king. Yeah.
In the movie, you see like an ape encounters the obelisk and then has the idea to pick up a bone and use that as a tool to smash more bones. And then one tribe of apes is able to use their tools to prevail in warfare over the other tribe. You can see the beginnings of the constant human quest for technological improvement. And in the movie, it supposedly has something to do with this obelisk.
Well, and of course, in the movie, is ultimately about a confrontation with AI on this spaceship.
Yeah. It's a movie with a lot of layers, a ton of occult imagery and symbolism, and we're still unpacking it here in the year 2025. 25 years after Stanley Kubrick created that creepy movie about Eyes Wide Shut, about the strange Hyros Gamos sex ceremonies put on by the elite who run our society, and then mysteriously died of a heart attack like a day after the movie was first screened. So lots of strange conspiracy theories surrounding the untimely death of Stanley Kubrick in the early 2001, whenever that was that happened. And I think the last thread here is just to explain that obviously there's a relationship between the idea of a cube and the idea of a hexagram. All right, the hexagram is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object, right? If you take your pencil on a flat piece of paper and you draw a cube, you'll draw two squares slightly offset, and then connect the four corners of the squares with four more lines, and you get what looks like a rectangular or square prism on the page, but it's really a hexagram, right? A two-dimensional picture of a 3D cube has 6 sides, right? And this is why the 6-sided hexagram is a great symbol of the occult, And the last thing about the hexagram is it like, especially when you think of the hexagram as the Star of David, right? The Star of David is the hexagram, but with 6 pointed. Has the hexagram in the middle and 6 pointed sides around the outside, and it looks like an upward delta and a downward delta superimposed over each other, right? See, it encapsulates the alchemical saying "as above, so below." And that saying comes from the Emerald Tablet. That's where the "as above, so below" first enters history. See, because like the Christian king, the last emperors of Rome were all Christians who sought to shore up their waning political power by making Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire and wiping out all of its competitors. Right. This is when the Great Library of Alexandria met its end. But a lot of that pre-Christian pagan literature was contained within Islam and eventually retransmitted to the Christian West after the Crusades revived economic currents across Europe. And so this text, the Emerald Tablet, is an Arabic text. And a lot of the alchemy words like alembic or even alchemy itself come from Arabic origins. And so it's very, very interesting, the interplay here between the pre-Christian pagan writings stored by Muslims, during the heyday of Islamic civilization in the Middle Ages, and then the way that those plus some additions like the Emerald Tablet were, like I say, retransmitted back to Christendom. And so, and this concept, as above, so below, became like the basis of like all modern occultism. Obviously, this idea of, as you have here in the studio, Brian, a beautiful picture of the Tree of Life, and the Tree of Life is rendered with symmetrical branch and root structures to illustrate this idea of as above, so below. And the concept is also reflected in the macrocosm versus the microcosm. Right? The Bohr theory of the atom features atomic nuclei orbited by electrons, and also our model of the solar system looks exactly the same, with a star or stars at the center of the solar systems orbited by planets instead of electrons. But there's a symmetry between the macrocosm and microcosm revealed by science in our own time, which reflects this as above, so below sort of philosophy.
Yeah. So if you listen to like conspiracy podcasts, there's this idea that the people in charge are like these black cube cultists or something. Although obviously people are worshiping this thing already, and it's like not a secret. So I don't know. But I mean, there's this idea that like Saturnists are Satanists or something. Like Jupiter is supposed to be like Zeus in like Greek mythology, right? Yes. And so who is Saturn supposed to be?
Saturn is one of the so Jupiter or Zeus is a later generation, right? He is given birth to by the dread gods, like the dread gods that came before him. So like Saturn gives birth to, let me make sure I get this right. It's Cronus, right? The god of time that Saturn gives birth to and then devours the very same, right? Isn't it Cronus who Saturn is devouring in that famous Goya picture, of Saturn that's in like that movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas from 1985? I think that's right.
I don't know.
Well, okay. So yeah, the black cube is a major feature of like occultism. And so it's just interesting to see some of these ancient origins and how far back the idea goes. As above, so below, going back to the 6th or 7th century. And then the black cube going back into time immemorial before that. The podcast of the week this week is about Plato's allegory of the cave and its relationship to the UFO phenomenon we're seeing today. And the interesting thing about, and we'll get into it as the podcast, as we start playing the quotes here, but the idea is that the reality we live in is a construct, and it's a construct that is mediated by a consensus. It's a consensus reality. Now, this is a Platonic view of reality as some kind of an illusion instead of bedrock reality, as we frequently assume. And so, it's if in fact reality is just this this large function where consensus collapses into a single reality, then that might explain why it might explain why the universe appears to us to cleave to this as above, so below framework. And furthermore, it might explain why we are seeing occult symbolism on the planets themselves, because these might, like the the fundamental assumption of modern science is that we are minds inside a large universe observing them. But the basis of all of magic is that the minds have a say in creation also. And so if we're definitely going to talk much more about this. But yeah, we are really going to play with reality as a slippery concept here as we get through this American Alchemy podcast, which talks about, as I mentioned, UFOs with respect to Platonism, the ancient philosophy. What do you think, Brian? Are we ready to get into it?
Sure. I guess we'll take a brief break and then we'll listen to some podcast clips.
All right. That sounds pretty good.
Our crazy place in the universe.
We'll be back after this, folks. And we're back. All right. Well, as mentioned in the first part of this episode, we are going to dive right into the clips that I've arranged here from this is the American Alchemy podcast. It's made by this man, Jesse Michaels. He used to make the Portal podcast with Eric Weinstein, but of course, as we all know, Dr. Weinstein has shut down the Portal, at least since 2020. And so his producer / the man who put the show together with Weinstein as the talent is now using his American Alchemy podcast to go down the UFO rabbit hole. And so his most recent is this. He invited this man who has written a book about Platonism and UFOs, and in the relationship between the phenomenology of the UFOs and the philosophy of Plato, as elucidated in the 4th century BC by the main man himself. So I guess without further ado, Brian, in clip number 1, our two principals will discuss exactly what is Plato's allegory of the cave, something we've talked about many a time on this pod. Take it away, Brian.
What is the cave at a baseline for the average person?
Sure. Okay, so at a certain point in the dialogue, the question of how we would educate a philosopher comes up. Okay. Mm-hmm. And basically, the cave is Plato's way of explaining what the education of the philosopher would be like. Mm. Okay. So I think that's important to see. Like that's where it's proposed. Mm. Okay. And in the analogy or allegory that he uses to make the point is, he says, so we have a bunch of people, they're in a cave, they're chained so they can only look forward, and all they see are images dancing on the cave wall. Okay. And then at some point, and I think if that were the case, no one could possibly know the difference, right? There's no ability to separate yourself from this, right? So it would be what we would call today a consensus reality. Yeah. Right? Okay. Yeah. And now Plato never explains this, but voila, somebody gets loose. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's interesting. We never get an explanation of how that initial liberation would happen. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that person is able to turn and look away. It's a very important thing that Plato emphasizes, is that person looks away from the wall and can see back and see that what's really going on is there's a wall behind them, and there's people behind it with puppets on sticks, and there's a fire casting light onto the wall, right? So what the people see on the wall is not entirely wrong, right? The shadows are right-ish, but they're not fully right. Okay. And so this newly liberated person sees that, right? And then goes through a process of maybe even literally clawing his way out of the cave. It's a difficult, arduous process, right? And what he's moving towards is towards a sort of light, right? Okay, so the fire initially that he saw, that was part of the put on, that's a kind of light. It's enlightenment. It's a sign of knowledge, right? But it's not full knowledge. And think of it for the Greeks, we didn't say something like this, all energy, all heat, all fire on the earth is ultimately derived from the sun, right? Okay, so he's looking for the source of that fire, right? And he crawls his way out of the cave and eventually, can get out, and it's very difficult. So he has to leave and come back a little bit. It's very difficult to get out of the cave and see in the light for the first time. And eventually he works his way up to glimpsing the sun, okay? Glimpsing what Plato elsewhere calls the good, right? But he can only glimpse it, right? And so then he returns to the cave, and of course, in returning to the cave, the light has changed again, and he stumbles around as if he's blind, so he looks like a fool, right? He presses people that there's more to the world. What you're seeing is an illusion, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, famously, it ends badly for him, just as it ended for Socrates very badly. Yeah.
And there seems to be sort of push and pull. Like this person is ascending out of the cave on their own sort of volition, but they're also being sort of dragged. Is that right?
Or because you think of it like throughout the book, it's clear for Plato, enlightenment doesn't just happen. You have to be taught. Like really, you could make a case. The book is a philosophy of education. Right. It's what should our ruling elite be like? Like, how should they be educated? Right. And the one thing Plato would say is you cannot just let nature take its course this way. Right. Like, people are not disposed to take themselves out of illusion. Right. They're disposed to stay in illusion. Right. So someone has to be pulling.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that really gets at the heart of matters coming right out of the gate, eh, Brian? Obviously, we've talked about Plato's cave any number of times on this podcast, and the man did a good job, obviously, there of giving us the basics. And what he's hinting at, and what we'll talk much more about here, is this idea that we live inside a structure, not reality itself, and that escaping that structure is part of how to make a better political system. And that there is somebody or something pulling us along in this journey of transcendence, right? There's someone, in other words, we aren't just prisoners tunneling our way out of the prison, right? There's someone else tunneling to meet us, underground, tunneling into the prison at the same time, right? So this is where the aliens start to come into play.
Well, I don't know if the allegory of the cave says that someone's tunneling the other way.
Well, this man's argument is that it's implied within the structure of the story.
I guess it doesn't explain how he got free. So I guess in that part, is how you're coming to that conclusion.
There's odd things about the cave. We're first going to focus on the guardians. These are the people behind our chained prisoners who are waving the puppets and creating the puppet show on the wall of the cave that everyone believes is reality because they've got nothing to compare it to realize that they're looking at an illusion. And so there's a couple of mysteries here, like who are the guardians? Why are they participating in projecting an illusion for everyone to live in? And then who is it that's trying to lure us out of the cave? Who's either trying to push or pull us along? They're trying to push or pull like the individual seeker of enlightenment, but they're also pushing and pulling society at large. So
I guess it seems like there's more powerful forces trying to keep you chained to the wall, but I suppose there are some kind of forces trying to break the illusion as well.
Yeah. It's interesting. It kind of gets to the flim-flam that's at the heart of all the class structures we always live in, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer because of some kind of a scam perpetrated by the upper class on the lower class, right? This is all part of... It is in the Republic in which Plato is weighing like monarchy versus democracy, right? He's a man who just had his master Socrates put to death by the democratic mob that took over Athens in the aftermath of the Persian Wars. So Plato famously comes down against democracy and posits this rule by a philosopher king as the ideal system of governance for any society. And with that, I suppose we should move on into clip number 2 here, where we will talk more about the aforementioned guardians, but listen for this man to use the word greed. Or he says that Plato comes to the conclusion that greed destroys all societies, that all societies are fundamentally flawed for that reason. Understand that in the Greek, the word is pleonexia, right? The wealth addiction that Plato warns about, how you can, if you have an addiction to food, you can only eat so much of it before you're inevitably satisfied. But wealth addiction, you can never be satisfied. It's always more. No matter how much wealth you get, you'll always want more. Whereas at least gluttony, you have to take a break from the feasting table, occasionally, because you can be satisfied with food or drink or many of the other things people get addicted to. Pleonexia is the dangerous one, according to Plato, and it's still the issue that rots at the rotten heart of American society to this day. All right, so Brian, folks, listen for greed and just remember that the word in Plato is pleonexia. Take it away, Brian.
Yeah. Is the implication that the guardians or the puppeteers, are they outside of the cave or are they in the cave or where do they sort of exist spatially in this analogy?
Let me give you a spooky answer to that.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
So at a certain point in the Republic, Plato has Socrates and the fellows arrive at this conclusion that the guardians will have to be told, in some translations, good lies about the afterlife. Okay. Meaning like they have to be told stories that will like let them see that there's going to be a reward for a certain type of behavior that's like the best for the state, right? Okay. And the book ends with a myth about the afterlife. Okay. So what do we get? We get a good lie about the afterlife. Okay. Now my read on that is what Plato's doing is he's saying, look, I just dragged you through the same educative process that I was outlined in the book. Right. Do you see what I mean? So like, it's like, it would seem there has to be somebody outside of the cave doing this. Like somebody has to, from the perspective of enlightenment, be pulling us through. Do you see that?
Yeah.
The whole book, I think, tricks you into following that very process.
And the guardians themselves are told a lie, and then they sort of purvey the lie as well.
Yeah.
They transmit the lie. That's fascinating.
In their training, he says they would have to be told. It's some translations call it a good myth. Some translate, I like this because I'm a contrarian, call it a good lie.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, everyone has to be lied to in this process. Yeah.
And the guardians, the implication there is they're guardians of this ideal city-state. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then do we have any understanding of who is telling them this sort of noble mythology?
Yeah. And keep in mind, like this is a problem because Plato earlier said any natural city is going to fall apart because of natural human greed and you know, selfishness and such, right? So how you could ever get this off the ground doesn't seem to be within like a legitimate human possibility for Plato.
So there are all these ways you could take this. You could take this as a total like myth or whatever. And I think the festival, right, that this was sort of told at was a festival of myth. Is that right?
Well, it was certainly a Greek, you know, religious festival, right? So yeah, exactly.
And then there's a so that's like on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it's like this is all true. This is like a descriptor of ontological truth and reality. Yeah. And I guess where do you fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I don't. So the way I like to put it is I don't think Plato is a Platonist. Okay, what I mean is the kind of philosophy 101 that we all teach our students, because you have to tell some good myths to get things going. Be careful there, but okay. Is very much a caricature of Plato. Do you see what I mean? Okay, and so but I also think there's something. So I do think there's a lot of put on going on in the book. I think we're being toyed with in certain ways.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it's a kind of a test. Like, do you get it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But I also think he's perfectly serious about some of the things in that book.
Right.
Okay. So for instance, at the end, the concluding myth, the myth of I don't take that as a serious speculation on his part of what the afterlife is like or something like that. Okay. And it's interesting because at the end of the myth, this is getting in the weeds, but people can go read the book. But at the end of the myth, goes back to temporal life, but unlike everyone else, he's granted memory of where he's been. Okay. And Plato, throughout his writings, has Socrates defend the notion that all knowledge is actually recollection of something that we already had. Okay. And so I think what you're getting here then is this suggestion that like our relationship to the ultimate truth is going to be more like memory than it is something like a direct discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he says to kind of distrust your like five senses, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like this primordial knowledge is more true in a sense. And so totally, because you could say that, you know, it's all mythology or whatever when it comes to him even saying that. But then in the book of Meno, you know, they literally have this slave draw a triangle, and the slave is, you know, completely uneducated. And that's sort of proof that there is this kind of primordial architecture and knowledge. And I believe also in the symposium, it was, you know, a knowledge of geometry was somehow not only emphasized, but almost like a litmus test for like admission.
Like, so we could teach anybody this if we just reminded them the right way.
Yeah, so interesting stuff there about the Guardians having to be taught lies so that they will agree to deceive their fellow man, which is interesting there. And then there's also, and then they pivot here into Platonism. How knowledge is more like a memory, how it comes from within and not without. This is the archetypes, right? This is like what is the masculine arc, like the James Bond archetype, right? Well, it's a complex way of being, how James Bond might act in any given scenario. But we can all guess how the man might act because we're familiar with the character, because the character matches an a priori concept of masculinity, let's say. So that's very interesting. This idea that real knowledge is more like a memory and less like something you might get peering through a telescope and speculating about the results.
Well, so forgive my ADD, but did he say exactly who the Guardians are supposed to be within the context of the allegory of the cave? Like within the city, it's easy to imagine the Guardians as guardians of the city and the people and whatnot. But in the cave, I mean, it's not like the people casting the shadows are supposed to be the Guardians, right? You'd think they would be the people guiding people out of the cave or something like that.
The identity of the Guardians, I believe, is left ambiguous. The philosopher kings of Plato's ideal state would be the ones who would find their way out of the illusion cast by the Guardians and crawl their way into the light, possibly induced by some outside forces.
All right. Well, see, I feel like the Guardians can't be the ones casting the shadows.
Well, they definitely are. They refer to them as the puppeteers, or the Guardians.
All right.
Yeah, they're definitely the ones.
Well, it seems like the Guardians should be like the ones sort of getting people out of the cave. But all right.
Yeah, maybe they're just the forces of conservatism, right? The propensity of people to the inertia that systems have, right? They're hard to change. So maybe that's who the Guardians are. In any case, there's a lot left in here up to interpretation, which is why this podcast was so fascinating to me.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we got the point of the Guardians here and how pleonexia inevitably destroys all societies unless you find some countermeasure to it. And so maybe we should now. Clip number 3, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about UFOs and the light that the person in Plato's cave is crawling towards as they undergo this journey of improvement. Yeah, so take it away with number 3, if you would, Brian.
Can I circle back to the light metaphor?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I think it's important to note in the Republic, okay, and we could get in interesting things with this with later philosophy too, but Plato talks, like he uses the sun as this metaphor. And of course, it's all, like the sun's a pretty going metaphor already. So like you have the Icarus myth, where if you want the knowledge of the gods and you fly too close, you're going to crash, right? So think of it like by Plato suggesting that we could glimpse the sun. This is very transgressive stuff for the time, right?
Yep.
But he says that the thing with the sun is it's the source of the light by which we see everything else. Okay. So then there's a question like, how could you see the sun? Do you see, it's sort of like it's, you have to take the glasses off that you look through and look at them without your glasses, right? And so I think that's important in that for Plato, you're never going to be able to point to the good. You're never going to be able to point to ultimate being because it's the source by which anything else can be illumined to be pointed at, right? So in any kind of like temporal empirical sense, we're always going to fall short. We're always going to fall short, always going to fall short because it's sort of the horizon against which we can judge things. It's not something in front of the horizon that we can judge, right? So it's sort of, Plato, I think, is predicting in this life perpetual failure, right? Yeah.
It's yeah. And so okay, I'm sure a lot of people at this point in the interview are thinking, Jesse, you have a show about UFOs.
Yeah, that's right.
What the hell does any of this have to do with UFOs? How did you even think to reconcile? People say, all philosophy is a, footnote of Plato or whatever. Like he's really the founder of Western philosophy. How did you think to reconcile that with UFOs, this sort of modern craze of objects in the sky we can't identify? Yeah,
that's a tricky question. So, I think like a lot of people, I got kind of, triggered about the UFO in like 2017 when, when suddenly it was okay to talk about this, And then I remember I think it was 2021, I always tell the story, I was watching X-Files with my kids that summer, and it was right when the big first Pentagon press conference happened. And I'm like, so I guess Mulder was right. There'd been this like switch, like it's suddenly they're saying, no, maybe there's something to this, which, you know, my like basic immune response to everything is like to study, right? Right. And to do scholarship. So I start reading all the books and all that. And I think what connected it with Plato for me is just that metaphor of we could be really, really wrong as a consensus about what the actual nature of being is, right? I thought I was starting to see the UFO was a great, at least thought experiment about that, right? Like, does it seem at all plausible to me that there could be something, even in like our nearly empirical reality, that humans have just like systematically missed for our entire history, right? And the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about things that I was already working on in philosophy of mind and cognitive science and speculative metaphysics, it seemed, oh, hell yeah. Yeah, it seemed like we really could be missing something that was like concretely right there all along.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even prosaically in a modern scientific context, we see, you know, between 400 and 700 nanometers of the electromagnetic wave spectrum. Yeah. You know, our decibel range is, you know, cut off. And so, like, to say that we are measurement sensors that are limited inside of a larger reality, I don't think is too controversial.
No.
And then, you know, do UFOs somehow speak to that because they seem weakly entangled with our reality? They seem to be sort of ephemeral. Jacques Vallée, you know, which you write about very eloquently in your book, talks about, you know, in Passport to Magonia and others books, a lot of past mythology involving, you know, the denizens of Magonia, like coming down on clouds, or, you know, all sorts of craft with wheels of Ezekiel, you know, the blazing shields of Rome. You know, often it's these sort of this proto-architecture that's very true and real, and then we are sort of recollecting it through the lens of sort of modern mythology.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So just the first thing that comes to mind here, you asked the question earlier, how can we be sure that there's, in what sense does this cave allegory imply an outside force pushing or pulling us out of the cave, right? And like, if observation affects the reality we're living in, like in a dream, right? You're simultaneously creating and observing the dreamscape you're inhabiting. If that's the case, then we could really never learn anything about, like, if we are living in a prison of our own manufacture, right? If reality is a prison of our own manufacture, you would never really be able to tell when you're dealing with something of your own creation or something that's actually there, right? They talk about this at other points in the podcast, our two principles do. But the idea is that it would be impossible to conceive of the light that leads you on this journey, this journey of transcendence, without some kind of outside help, since it's, by definition, that part of creation that is not created by us. Is that making any sense at all? That there is no way for us to grok the light independently of some help, because we can't separate the man-made from what's actually going on. Am I making the first bit of sense here, Brian?
Well, I mean, UFOs would be maybe something that gets the chained prisoner to realize that the shadows on the wall are shadows on the wall, right? Yeah. It's something that like supersedes the regular phenomenon of So, observing those shadows.
You might say that the black hexagram on Saturn's North Pole, right? It's there because it's put there by some external force. This is just positing this, but like, suppose we're seeing a black hexagram on Saturn's North Pole because that's meant to be something that wakes us up, that tells us we're in an illusion, right? It's like a little glitch in the matrix to tell you the matrix, that you were in a matrix, right? So this man is speculating here that it's possible that there are things in our reality which are placed there by some outside agent in order to alert us to the fact that we're living in an illusion, right? And then that's how you leave a trail of breadcrumbs for humanity to follow throughout the course of our history.
Well, I mean, I don't think it necessarily has to be like a trail of breadcrumbs, but it's just like an indicator.
Yeah.
Like if you just see like, if you start noticing like the edge of the movie screen.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not necessarily a trail of breadcrumbs, but maybe like just a feature of the system once you start to observe the system as a whole.
Yeah. But the reality is incomplete on purpose is the suggestion here. That the reality has little indicators that it is an illusion specifically for this purpose. Don't know. I mean, again, this is wild speculation, but when faced with UFO phenomenon, I mean, I think some wild theories are called for, and maybe that's it. Maybe that's what's going on here.
Well, I mean, to consider the question of like who the guardians are within the cave again. I mean, maybe the illusion on the wall is something to keep, the lower order, apes or whatever, entertained or doing something that isn't like killing each other. And then, just not everyone is going to be ripe for seeing the edges of the system, but maybe, the illusions are the shadows on the wall are good for, at some lower order, of society. So maybe that's the way, it fits in.
That's an interesting thought. I've always considered the Guardians to be misguided in the way that they deceive the rest of us, but maybe there is some purpose behind it, as you're saying. They also mentioned there how these strange phenomenon, flying things in the sky, go back. You can find UFO-like accounts at any epoch in history you want. You just have to, but they're just interpreted through the varying mythologies of the various societies that saw them. And they brought up Ezekiel's wheel, as found in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible. Very odd that you would have something spinning in the sky. And then there's descriptions in the Hindu Vedas or Roman pictures of people flying on shields through the air, or indeed that famous Nuremberg woodcutting I always like to bring up with the space battle over Nuremberg in the 16th century. It's interesting that's an important part of this, that the UFOs, we interpret the lights in the sky through our own sci-fi cultural fixation, but past cultures interpreted the lights in the sky through whatever religious milieu they happen to be living in at the time.
I mean, specifically after World War II, these UFOs took on a technological significance.
Yeah. What Roswell was like the year after the first atomic detonations in Japan. I mean, it's really, the timing is odd, to say the least, eh? Yeah. Well, Brian, should we move on to clip number 4 here, where we're going to talk, more about the nature of the cave and reality itself, and even get into dimensionality.
My take on going back to the cave metaphor, if that's okay,
yeah,
is I subscribe to some ideas in cognitive science and philosophy of mind that would sort of like make us think that maybe the cave is not just a bug, but a feature of human cognition. Okay, and you sort of alluded to this: is that if we're faced with like a very complicated reality, right? It would seem one of the most important things that we would be able to do would be able to sort for relevance. Okay. And so, meaning like the mind may work, and I think there's some pretty good empirical stuff on this, as much by learning what to ignore as it does by learning what to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you think of it then, what are we doing? I like this metaphor. We're constantly carving a cave out. And like the stuff that we do see, it's there. Okay. I'm not an idealist, right? So the stuff that we do see, it's there. The problem is there's always more there than it. Otherwise we couldn't cognize. Do you see that? Okay. So then though, there's going to be this really thorny problem always of like, how do we ever tease out like what is just our carving out and leaving something behind? Okay. Or as opposed to illusion, as opposed to what's really there, et cetera, et cetera. I think once you admit that there is a irreducible human contribution to our perception of the world.
Yes.
How you ever tease those two things back out is going to be the thorniest problem possible. Yeah.
Just admitting that opens your mind to a whole host of possibilities. I love in the 3-body problem, in the Dark Forest trilogy, this, Chinese science fiction novel involving aliens, UFOs. It's like the farmer and the shooter, and you have, people on a 2D plane, and bullets are shot, or bullet holes are shot into that 2D plane. And to them, that could just be like, you know, little craters, and they're playing with Flatland is another good example. You know, it's 19th century, you know, a book about this stuff, where to the people on the 2D plane, the holes could just be literally, you know, they're not discretionary holes made by shooters that they can't even perceive.
Right.
And so we're inherently sort of limited by our scope of perception, and making that argument is an a priori assertion, but denying that argument is also an a priori assertion. And so you're at this kind of epistemic impasse vis-a-vis modern science, where if you propose anything like that, they just have nothing to say. And then you point towards like these ephemeral glimpses of UFOs or people who have like near-death experiences, and you say these things are much richer than meet the eye. And then they say, oh, this is your mind plays tricks on you, blah, blah, blah. And you end up in this sort of like impossible to resolve argument.
Anaporia is like the classic. Sort of like it's a puzzle.
Oh, interesting. I've never heard that concept. That's awesome.
And one of my favorite ways of putting this, it comes from William James.
Yeah.
He has this great analogy he uses. He thinks like humans are not unlike dogs and cats running around a library, or not unlike our dogs when we're in the living room having a conversation about like the most, you know, high level stuff, and your dog's there thinking it's like kind of hot shit, right? It's like doing the dog thing. And of course, all the sounds and smells and stuff it encounters are really there, but it's a carve out from something much richer. Right?
Yes.
But he's hearing what you're saying, but it can't possibly mean anything to him because it's just not relevant to his way of being.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it would be, we think of things like cellular automata, or like, you know, getting fungus to grow in certain ways or whatever, you know, like that's easy. It's predictable, right?
Yeah.
We could easily be cellular automata in some larger system where, you know, you have B.F. Skinner, you know, Pavlov's dog. You have all these ways to like condition humans like extremely easily. Like that's not that hard.
Yeah.
And how do we know that that's not being done to us on some sort of grand scale? And that's the Jacques Vallée kind of control system hypothesis.
No, that was one of the things that really turned me on was that. Well, here's an example just from the last 24 hours for me. Okay, so I live in a very small town in rural Kansas. Okay. And so, you know, I'm here in Austin visiting you, and it's you walk around when you're used to being in a small town, and you're in this human context that's on this incredible scale, right? And you start to notice all the ways you're being managed just by the structure of the city and the structure of the airport and all these ways, and you have this sudden sense you don't have the same feeling of control as you do, say, back in a small town, right? Okay, and then it always strikes me whenever I fly into a major metropolitan area how small and minor it looks on the landscape as you come in, right? So it's like here I have a sense of I'm somehow being moved around by a larger reality just by being in the city. But then if we move out our magnification a bit, we'll see the city as itself just part of this much bigger ecosystem of things, and it's not clear who's running that, et cetera, right? And so it seems like our level of magnification, right?
Yes.
Like it affords different senses of what the real substance of things are.
Yeah. Okay. So the simile I like to make here is Michelangelo, the sculptor, confronted with a solid block of marble. You know, he'll close one eye and hold one thumb up and look at that block, and he'll see within it, you know, the exquisite forms of the David. You know, and he'll take his chisel and his hammer and discard all of the surrounding marble that encases David, you know, thereby revealing the great hero, you know, of biblical myth for all of us to go see at the Museum of Fine Arts in Florence, you know, in 2025. But I think our lads are missing something here, right? Because there is that like reality tunnel where you, like, if you believe, suppose you believe you're a giant winner or you're a giant loser, right? You'll forget the anecdotes in your life that don't support your preconceived notion of yourself. You'll discard memories. If you're a winner, every time you lost, you'll forget those and just remember the times you've won. And if you think of yourself as a loser, you'll just remember all the times you lost and forget the times you've won. Right? And that way we sort of chisel our own tunnel through this reality. Each one of us has a slightly different one. And then we can mitigate what we're seeing linguistically with each other to form this reality we think we live in, right? But essentially, I think we're missing something with that because there is an element of dimensionality here, right? Plato explicitly invokes dimensionality with his 2D figures being cast by three-dimensional puppeteers on the wall. The man mentioned dimensionality in Flatland there at some point in that last clip also, right? I think that there is a broader... We are experiencing only 3 of 11, 21 dimensions, however many dimensions there actually are. We're just experiencing a narrow sliver, only 3 of those possible dimensions. So in addition to the reality that we make through our memory, I think we're also stuck in a prison of our own perception because our perception is so limited. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, so he's going on to describe how the cave metaphor is like a feature rather than a bug, which was kind of what I was speculating about before.
Yeah.
And we can kind of see that they're bringing more context to that. Well, I don't know if that relates to your dimensionality point or not.
He was just saying that that we tend to. My interpretation of Plato and what the man's saying is that we are all unconsciously creating this cave. Like maybe we are the creators of the illusion in which we're inhabiting. That interesting.
Well, the cave is like a way to like parse the overwhelming amount of information out there.
Yes. Yeah.
It's necessarily going to be limited based on how you want to focus. Your Eye of Sauron.
Yeah. But there's a part of that where just the nature of observation and your culture, gives you creates that illusion. And then there's another part where we're just as observation platforms, we're just terribly limited, and all of these things are going on around us, and we can't perceive them. Like we never could. We can maybe perceive some of the effects of them, but we can't perceive the 4th and 5th and 7th and 12th dimensions at all, right? We can only, in the same way that your shadow on the sidewalk, there's no way that the flat version of yourself could ever possibly conceive of the 3 dimensions in which you actually exist, right? They're stuck in a lower order dimension. So,
there's like the higher dimensionality phenomenon that we have no way to observe, but then there's also the signs of the higher dimensions that we can observe, but
that's
are unable to understand the meaning of and act rationally in light of.
Yes. That's pretty much it. Yeah. So I reckon we're ready then to move on to clip number 5.
People don't think correctly, I think, and so that's a sort of crazy thing for me to say.
I know,
but it's like you could just say like New York Times, Congress, Schumer Amendment. You say these things. Somebody who holds a Q clearance, and then all of a sudden they go, "Oh, credentials." They go, "Whatever you say next, as far as what they believe, I now believe." And then you could go into all these sort of first principles, like more interesting inquiries into like how reality works, a la what we're doing now.
Yeah,
and it's like. It's, not even wrong or like unfalsifiable or like crazy or whatever. Because you need to somehow, their receptors around like, credentialism need to be like met first. And then they're like, oh, well, let me listen, It's like, that's just not the way you should inquire.
Sort of, you might have heard about some of the honest placebo studies.
No.
Okay, so apparently, I'm probably not getting all the details right, but apparently there are cases where there have been experiments where they told people, this is a placebo. This is an inert substance.
Yep.
And we're giving it to you.
It still helped. I believe that.
If the person giving it to them still had like the lab coat.
Yeah.
Right. And it was in the right kind of packaging. Like, so like if some, dude shows up at the door and gives you a bag of pills, and it's probably not going to work, right?
Yeah.
But like if someone dresses up like a doctor, like an authority figure, all the credentials, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we have to really mistrust.
Totally. Well, and there's certain people who have an a priori disposition towards magic, and then others who don't. Yeah. And then that becomes their reality. Like it's like the Plato thing where it's like everything I'm going to tell you is a lie. And they're like, then why would you say that? And you get all confused. And then he goes on to tell some like stuff that like there's clearly some truth in it.
Exactly.
And then, maybe there's some lies, but like you're extremely intrigued. There are layers to this, like Leo Strauss, this, 20th century philosopher. He was a big Platonist too.
But he also thought those books were full of lies too.
Totally, but then you never know if he was writing in a coded fashion himself. And so it was like, and then like the people around him like had these like weird communication techniques. And so it's this never ending thing. And you could say the exoteric is implying meaning that doesn't exist.
Right.
And the esoteric is like the room and, is actually empty when you get to it. And it's like, it's all some coordination mechanism.
Yeah.
Or you could say the exoteric is throwing people off the trail and and the more you like talk about that from a meta sense, then you're going and you've created this cult.
Yes.
And it's
yeah. And so, I actually do this in the book where I say, okay, using the example of the Tic Tac. Okay, so what's my evidence of the Tic Tac? Well, this seemingly very reliable Air Force pilot, and and Alex Dietrich and David Fravor, they said these things, right?
Raytheon FLIR systems.
Yeah, okay. And so I have like testimony from seemingly reliable people, right? Okay. And if you say, yeah, but it like, how can you buy that? But yet, like, I only know Bin Laden was shot.
Yep.
Because of testimony
media.
From that came through the media through reliable like Pentagon officials. I only know. And now, of course, maybe some of that stuff we shouldn't be so quick to believe.
Yeah, that's my favorite clip of this episode. It really cuts to the main contention of the system failure constellation of ideas that power and authority shape reality. And that when systems of authority collapse, as they did during the fall of Rome or late medieval society, that entire conceptions of reality come tumbling down along with these authoritative systems. And that, like, when the medieval authority collapses, you get the Black Death and your Protestant Reformation, your Renaissance, when that happens, you get things like people realizing that the Earth orbits the sun and not vice versa, right? Up until that moment, any fool could see the sun moving across the sky, but once the illusion was shattered, it was shattered forever, right? So it's very interesting to me how that little clip shows how reality really is defined by the authorities. And that, I think, is the best answer for who the Guardians are, right? You've got your people in white lab coats who have themselves been told a very good lie or myth, depending on your translation, and who believe it, and so therefore fool the rest of us unconsciously, not realizing what they're doing.
Yeah, well, credentialism is obviously this two-edged sword, in which you obviously get the advice of the experts, but if the experts are wrong, it doesn't help you.
Yeah, the experts may be mistaken, and the experts may also be corrupt or both, which makes for a complex skein of yarn to have to unwind, eh, Brian?
Yeah, well, and if you're in a place where, as a people, we are ready for the mantle of more advanced civilization, but, the experts and the authorities are established in the prior paradigm, then you're in for some contention, huh?
Well, you've said it exactly. They'd like to preserve the world order in which they are at the top of the hierarchy, and they're not looking for a new world order in which they could be anywhere in the hierarchy, and so they're trying to kick the can down the road and keep the status quo rolling as long as we possibly can, because we're ruled by authority.
All right, well, should we take a quick break?
Yep, all right, quick little break, and then we'll be back with the rest of the clips. And we're back. All right, so next up is clip number 6, and clip numbers 6 and 7 are back to back. The first one, they're just going to briefly describe the myth of which seems relevant, the last piece of Plato's Republic, and then they'll turn right from that into the Eleusinian mysteries. But we'll first hear about the myth of here. Brian, if you could take us away with clip number 6.
And you have, speaking of true knowledge as some sort of sense memory.
Yeah.
That is not, the 5 sort of lower senses.
Yeah.
And, we should probably talk about the myth of air, which, the end of the Plato's Republic, which you talked about. That is such a fascinating myth. Also kind of, I think, dogmatically taken as allegory by, modern scholars.
Yeah.
What do you make of that story? And maybe rehash the story for the audience.
Yeah. So, in the Republic, was a virtuous person. He dies in battle for the city. That does all the Greek good stuff, right? And he goes, and then it's all wound up with fairly conventional, Athenian views about the afterlife. So he crosses the river Styx, and all the right gods are there. But then it comes to a point where there's kind of a drawing of lots for where you're going to go in the next life. Okay. And what's interesting is one of the great rewards of the virtuous is they don't care what lot they get because they know no matter what, they'll be okay because they're going to have the excellences that carry them through. They'll have it. Right. Okay. So that's interesting. All right. And so everyone gets their assigned position for the next life and then they return. And interestingly, we mentioned this earlier. They all have to sleep next to the river of forgetfulness before they return, but the only one who doesn't drink is Okay. So the virtuous person remembers, right? And now, the virtuous person is indifferent to their lot in temporal life. Okay. Why? Because they remember, right? Because they know there's something else. Do you see that? So I know people will make something of it. Is this a recollection of a near-death experience for Plato, or maybe like the Eleusinian mysteries? Something maybe.
Okay, so you can hear their pivot to the Eleusinian mysteries right there at the end. Now, the Eleusinian mysteries, of course, we've talked about them many times in this podcast. Eleusis, 14 miles outside of Athens. People would go there, drink from the kykeon, the mystical chalice, and have this experience with it, after which they describe themselves as having been saved. Now, it is not yet a scholarly consensus, but more and more evidence is piling up that the center of these mystery religions of ancient Greece and Rome were centered around psychoactive drugs. And one of the signature effects of these psychoactive drugs is that they dissolve the ego, that they reveal not only reality to be an illusion, but also the self. And this is how the whispers among the pilgrims of Eleusis were that drinking from the kykeon would grant someone immortality. And once you stop identifying as yourself and identify instead as a series of people, then the illusion of reality also comes tumbling down at the same time. So I think with that, Brian, we can just go right into the Eleusinian mysteries and their relevance here. You'll hear the man repeat the same sentence at the top of this clip as he ended the last clip with, just to create the continuity here.
So I know people will make something of it. Is this a recollection of a near-death experience for Plato, or maybe like the Eleusinian mysteries? Something maybe. Like I'm perfectly open to that, right? I don't really have the classical scholarship to weigh in on that, right? But I do think what we're being told there is there's a kind of confidence, right, in the virtuous person, right, and a kind of in touch with, right, I just put it, an in touch with being, right, with the good that the virtuous person has.
Yes.
Yeah. You know what I mean? So that is to take it allegorically, but it's in a way that would like make a concrete difference for conduct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think that Plato? Because I look at the Eleusinian mysteries, and I know it's probably hard to say historically whether these what exactly happened here. Brian Murarescu writes a great book.
Though, yeah.
They were definitely up to something.
Yeah.
You have this place 13 miles northwest of Athens, this considered the spiritual capital. Yeah. That you had Greek leaders and Roman emperors saying this sort of held together society, the fabric of society, and you'd have these sort of guardians back then, if you will. Yeah. Plato, Socrates, Sophocles, Alcibiades was famously in trouble for talking about the mysteries when he wasn't. He was at a festival.
First rule of Fight Club, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Don't talk about it. And they all undergo these sort of they drink the kykeon, which is maybe, as speculated by Brian Murarescu, this sort of ergot that contains LSD, this sort of fungal derivative, and that unveils this sort of greater ontological reality, or maybe they experience noesis, kind of primordial knowledge or something. Do you think that was real and informed Plato?
I have no reason to rule that out. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? And like in a lot of ways, it's not like it's not like we discovered like peyote at Woodstock.
Do you know what
I mean? Like this stuff has been around, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think there's, you know what I mean? So I would be surprised if that wasn't, and we know it's been around in religion and all that, right? Okay. I mean, in like various pagan religions, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
Right? So I'd be surprised if there wasn't something like that going on. Does that make sense?
It does. It's just so funny how we, in the modern age of disenchantment, paint Plato over with this broad brush of like, it's all allegory. He is the father of Western civilization. It's the birth of rationalism. And it's like, well, I don't know. I think the guy was going to Eleusis and drinking some weird shit.
Especially when you read some of the dialogues like Phaedrus and the Symposium. Desire and love are running a lot, right? Okay, and I think that's important to note, right? And I think whatever the mysteries were, right? It does seem like it worked like this: is like you got like a cheat code to the goal line, right? And then you go back and spend the rest of your life trying to think your way back to it. Do you see what I mean?
I do. Yeah. You immediately like can't fully recollect what you saw with the light. It's almost like I was actually talking to David Grush about this in my interview with him, and he was like, it's almost like the symbol rate is too slow. Like you literally can't even communicate it in words.
How do you show the light by which we see other things, right? Yeah.
So you end up, maybe Jesus was one of these people, maybe not, but like prophets famously speak in riddles and allegories and parables, and it's you have to parse their word. I mean, you get the sense, we were talking before the show, Jacques Vallée, was just on Joe Rogan, and when I speak to Jacques, I get the sense that he knows a lot more than he can even communicate with this stuff. And he speaks in these sort of riddled, coded parables,
and not just because of like security clearance. Like it's inarticulable.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I think we already hammered most of the Eleusinian mysteries in particular, but there were a lot of mystery schools in Greece and Rome. Like there's like Pythagoras and the Orphic mystery schools and the ecstatic rites of Dionysus. The conservative Roman historian Livy, writing in the 1st century BC, has this account of Plato and Euripides, the playwright, the guy who wrote the Bacchae, the play about the god Dionysus, from which much is borrowed in the Gospel of John in the New Testament, including the turning water into wine at a wedding miracle. So this guy, Euripides, who wrote the Bacchae, and Plato went to Egypt to be inducted into the Egyptian mystery schools. Now, this is not in Livy, but what I've heard is that the induction by the Egyptian priesthood in the mystery schools there involved lying in a pharaoh's sarcophagus inside one of the pyramids for like 24 straight hours or 48 straight hours. I mean, I can't imagine lying there in the dark for all those hours, what would eventually happen to you. But that's a story that may be totally apocryphal that I've heard about those mysteries. But what's not in question here is that Livy wrote about Plato and Euripides, heading to Egypt for these for induction into these mystery schools. So it is like everybody who was anybody in Greco-Roman society underwent this process. I don't know of any Roman emperors with quotes about Eleusis. I think our man was channeling Cicero, or Cicero, if you want to pronounce it historically accurately, the Roman statesman and orator from the 1st century BC. And then there's also Praetaxtus, the Greek Roman, he was like a jurist or a lawyer, I guess, I think. But he had a quote saying about how Cicero had the quote up saying that the mysteries of Eleusis were the greatest thing that Greek society ever gave to Roman society, which is incredible when you think about how much of Roman society they got from the Greeks, in terms of their philosophy and their artwork and their mythology and all that stuff. So pretty wild stuff.
I like the bit about the partaking in the Eleusinian mystery being a cheat code to sort of the goal line, and then spending the rest of your life trying to think it through. That's pretty much the nature of it, huh?
Yeah. They mentioned Mororescu's Brian Mororescu, the lawyer, and the man started out as a scholar of Greek and Latin, he went to what do you call priest school when you go to school for priesthood? What's the word for that? Seminary. Went to seminary, learned Greek and Latin, realized there was no money to be made, and that became a lawyer, and then began, dealing with marijuana legalization. And this man wrote a book in 2020, which brings to light a lot of the evidence that's stacking up that the substances used at Eleusis or in the Dionysian mysteries were, in fact, psychedelic in nature. But yeah, that's Brian Morescu goes around on the podcast circuit, and he uses Amazon Prime as his simile to say the same thing. Like the idea here is that you take the psychedelics, and that shows you the map of where you need to go, but you still have to do the work in your own life of you have to actually undertake the journey. This just shows you in which direction you got to travel. Kind of like the North Star is how you navigate your ship. You don't ever expect to actually get there. It's just it's just like a way to orient yourself.
And what does that have to do with Amazon Prime?
Well, the idea here is that Google Maps, not Amazon Prime. Morescu suggests that the mysteries are like Google Maps, and that the profanation of the mysteries is like Amazon Prime. Right? This was the great innovation of Christianity. Right? Take the mysteries and move them into your own house, to have your secret suppers, remove them from under state control. So that was how he described, instead of having to go to Eleusis, Amazon Prime it to your house. Right? That was how he described Christianity. So you're right. I have mixed up my modern tech metaphors for the ancient world there. So good catch, Brian. And that brings us inevitably to our very last clip. This is number 8, and here we'll get back to 2001: A Space Odyssey, and hopefully we'll be able to bring this all to some sensible conclusion. Brian, take it away.
It's like in 2001: Space Odyssey, you have the monolith, which is inspires tech innovation, but then there's this idea, there's this like kind of hermeneutic reading of 2001 where it's actually a screen.
Yeah,
the 2000,
the proportions all line up. Yeah,
the proportions all. It's actually like the cinematic, like the movie age is the monolith, and so the monolith is somehow the noble mythology of the future, and that's the Pasulka's book starts out about how like media shapes our understanding of what we see.
Yes,
and maybe even literally, like Jacques Vallée talks about, maybe these aren't space aliens, but if we start to believe that enough, they'll appear, like this sort of egregore model of consensus reality, where reality is actually just a consensus collapsing function. It's not this sort of objective.
I mean, I think we can, not in a magical way, but we can pretend things into existence.
Do I agree.
Yeah. So you walk in the room and say, "Hey, Jim, how are you doing today?" And I'm going to say, "I'm doing fine," whether I feel fine or not.
Yep.
Right? It's like that. Some contemporary psychoanalytic thinkers, talk about like we're always performing for this big other that's in the room. But big other is something we've pretended into existence.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But now it's here, and like to act like I wouldn't feel a little weird if you didn't say, "I'm doing fine, Jim." When I ask how you're doing, I'd be lying. So big other's here, even though we know it's just something we pretend into existence.
Totally.
So it seems like we can pretend things into existence that then have a downward effect on us, right? Not unlike our technologies.
If I have some fake smile I put on for the next 3 hours, I think statistically, like I'm going to be like a little happier or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and then you're like, okay, if that's true, science is actually like the most political, because science is sort of the modern mythology of today. It's the thing we hold most sacred.
Yeah.
It involves the founding myth, the Big Bang. It involves rituals, people with lab coats or whatever, and this sort of priestly citadel or whatever.
Remember the honest placebos? Those symbols of science work. Yeah.
They really work.
And that's something we've pretended into existence.
Do you think we see a shift into kind of, there's talks of a re-enchantment, and, this is from the Max Weber, German sociologist, the age of disenchantment, which we seem to, I think, be coming out of, like Richard Dawkins and all these guys, like who are like, hardcore, like atheist materialists. That does seem to be kind of ending. And you have Christians like Rod Dreher writing about this, and like you have a lot of people talking about this sort of re-enchant. I mean, I did not expect in starting this channel. I started it actually. It wasn't even originally about UFOs, and then I started to cover UFOs. I didn't think it would get this big on the UFO thing, but people are so fascinated by it.
So, I mean, I think you're right. There is. I mean, this is bad armchair sociology, right? Like, I think you're right. There's an openness that wasn't there, say in like the early 2000s, like when the big trend then was, the new atheists and all that, right? Okay. So I think there's going to be a difference between the Gen Zers from the millennials there. You know what I mean? Right? Because like the millennials kind of were coming online in the middle of the Richard Dawkins craze, and now like the Gen Zers are coming online in the middle of this, right? So I do agree with you, and I think there's a healthy openness to enchantment, but I also worry though too that it could become an unhealthy openness to mystification too. You know what I mean? Where like just any enchantment's going to do now.
Anything goes. Yeah. Or even an openness to maybe the most unhealthy versions of religion and things like that. Yeah.
So I worry that like the much abused pendulum swing metaphor, right?
Yep.
But I do worry that the swing could go to the irrational,
Yep.
right? Too. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do as well.
Yeah. And look, you can see in the UFO world, like some people will go for anything pro UFO, right?
Oh yeah. And they get super defensive where they're like, this is real. UFOs are real.
Yeah.
Like go on the sort of press circuit thing, and that's all they want. It's more of like a political campaign.
Yeah.
And it's not this sort of egoless search for truth. It's
so I do worry, that our recovery from materialism could slip into a kind of anti-enlightenment irrationalism too.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, it definitely could. What do you think if Plato were here today and he saw the UFO thing, the AI thing, like he saw this sort of like these really intense movements that involve secret technology, they involve, kind of asymmetric tail risk.
Yeah.
But they also involve the saving of humanity.
Yeah.
What do you think he would say?
I think he would mistrust the whole deal.
I love it.
I think he would.
That's
I think he'd
awesome.
say, "Hey, welcome to your cave, man."
Yeah.
I think he'd mistrust it.
Yeah, he would say, because the thing, it's probably like a lot of these things point charismatically at the truth, but they're all being used politically. They're all sort of political footballs or whatever. So it's like,
and I think so. I read the Republic as this is a manual for political skepticism.
I love that.
Yeah, and I think he would look at all this and say, we've seen this movie before, guys.
Yeah. Well, there are very few people, I think, who truly search for truth in a sort of trans-political way, where it's like it transcends self-gain.
Okay, well, that's all from our friend Jesse Michaels and his guest professor, philosopher James Madden. What did you think about this idea of the obelisk in 2001: A Space Odyssey being a metaphor or a simile to theater or cinema? That was a completely new one on me, Brian. I'd never heard that theory before this podcast, but thinking back to my memory of 2001. It does seem like that black obelisk, it's not an obelisk with a square base. It's a rectangular prism, which I guess they're saying has the same 16 by 9 dimensions. Or what are the dimensions of the movie theater screen? It's bigger than 16 by 9. It's wider, right? If you put a movie or like a Blu-ray on your 16 by 9 flat screen TV, you're going to still have some bars at the top and bottom. But whatever the aspect ratio is, it's an interesting theory that the obelisk represents like cinema. To me, the idea is interesting because because it's showing the past and future as being affected by modern cinema. So that to me suggests this idea that both the past and the future are intellectual objects more than they are actual realities, and that that this idea of the cinema is going to affect our conception of our past and our future simultaneously is kind of interesting.
Well, apparently movie screens are 45 by 19.
45 by 19, okay.
And I guess I have a hard time imagining, I mean, it must be if you have the obelisk like on its side, right? Or because it's not like a wide thing.
It's like stuck on its side, but I think what they're saying, and I'd have to look this up, but I think what they're saying is that aspect ratio matches the flat one of the two flat faces of the obelisk.
It must be the case. Well, it's easy to imagine the obelisk as a harbinger of technology, as we were saying before, and I guess movies are like a part of a cultural driving force. So maybe that's why it's the way it is.
There's something about movies. I don't quite know how this fits in, but there's something about movies that affect that cut to the heart of the subject-object relationship that is so tangled. Right? Modern science presumes that we are subjects observing an objective reality, and in the movies, right? If you go to the movies, you are not you are observing the movie, and the movie is not affected. Like the actors have no idea that you're there, right? But in the theater, right now, remember the theater was invented by the Greeks, right? The whole concept of drama came out of the Dionysian festivals, right? The first drama was the Bacchae, right? During the Bacchae, someone, the man's name was Thespis, right? Someone stepped out of the chorus line, adopted the identity of a character, and began speaking dialogue, right? And that's where we get the word thespian from. So that's a little interesting piece of this also. Well, I guess by way of a conclusion, Brian, I wondered what you thought of the talk of the new atheists and the generations there, because I was a big new atheist circa 2004. I had my Sam Harris, my Richard Dawkins, and my Christopher Hitchens books, and they seem to be the most sensible voices in town. And yet here we are in 2025, 20 years later, and Sam Harris is losing his podcast audience because he's acting as wittingly or unwittingly, he's acting as a guardian in our version of Plato's cave, and not someone who is helping us. His efforts are no longer moving us towards the light. They're keeping us trapped within the cave, or at least that's my current impression of Dr. Harris. And I've also noticed prominent figures like Michaela Peterson or Ava Vladingerbrook or Russell Brand adopting. It seems like it's become a popular thing for these voices in social media to begin converting to Christianity, getting their baptisms. It seems like I thought for sure we were seeing the last gasps of religion in 2004, and that we were soon going to be free of an oppressive creed, but it seemed like religion's making a comeback, and we're all leaving the new atheists in our rear view now. That is an interesting development. What do you think about that, Brian? I mean, that must sort of match your experience, eh?
Yes. Well, somewhat related to talking of movies. I mean, movies are like pointless now. It's like Jurassic Park 7 or whatever. And how many more times can the dinosaurs break free? And the new atheist movement. Man, it sure was a big deal back in the day. I guess it seemed like, at least like Sam Harris was like a big supporter of blowing stuff up in the Middle East, and it kind of seems like a politically expedient message to spread, and also it seems to have contributed to the overall brain rot of that millennials and Gen Z's experience. And so, I mean, the reprise of Christianity, I suppose, is not surprising. Yep.
Well, the great ethnobotanist Terence McKenna has this rap that you can find on YouTube all about how sober the 13th century was. According to him, the Holy Roman Empire basically had Christendom on lockdown. They had what they said, what the church said was considered, was considered gospel, and it wasn't thought. People did not think critically about the dictates of the church. Right? They had everything their own way. And then you had like the Black Death and the sale of indulgences, where the church could, you could pay the church to cut down your years in purgatory. And then the real shameful bit where the church was like letting people pay for future sins, so you could buy like a get out of jail free card from the church. So like the naked corruption of the church and the Black Death started to cause this pessimism and discontent in Europe. And when that happened, the sobriety that had characterized the preceding century collapsed, and people began consulting horoscopes, and all manner of just magical belief became in vogue in Europe as people became disenchanted, with the political order promulgated by the Roman Catholic Church. So I don't know how true that really is, but that's the way T-Mac tells it. And it's also interesting that during the fall of Rome, the Roman authorities, who would have considered something like a resurrection, they had their own state-sanctioned miracles, of course, but the idea of a resurrection was completely impossible to them. And then you started to get these underground movements, Christianity, which arose in opposition to the cruel economic hierarchy of the Roman Empire. And then, just as in the late Middle Ages, and just as in 2025, the whispers of magic started to become louder on the lunatic fringes of society. And within a few hundred short years, the Roman state went from persecuting Christians and throwing them to the lions in the Colosseum to declaring Christianity, to declaring the doctrine of the resurrection to be the literal, like the official doctrine of the Roman state. So it's interesting to me when economic systems stop working so well for most people, and and dysfunction starts to pile up. People start to take a really close look at their emperor to see if that emperor is wearing any clothes, and they never are, because there's a flim-flam at the heart of every class war. And so it's interesting to me that magical thinking in the guise of Christianity arose and took over the Roman state as the Roman Empire collapsed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, and then that Christian authority calcified into its own corrupt version of itself that became the very thing that early Christians once revolted against in the Roman Empire during the late Middle Ages. And you have a new revolt against the authorities in the guise of the Italian Renaissance and in the Protestant Reformation. And then you get the replacement of the medieval feudal system with the capitalist industrial revolution version of society that we inhabit today. But except for now, that system is growing long in the tooth. And the Renaissance magic that challenged the authority of the church and became science has hardened to its own corrupt authority in our time. And so people are now waking up to the fact that the priesthood is advancing their own self-interest and not necessarily a version of the truth with any fidelity to it. And so we're watching the collapse of the authorities in real time. And shockingly, just like the fall of Rome and the end of the Middle Ages, a plague played an instrumental role in discrediting the authorities. I refer now, of course, to the COVID-19 epidemic. No matter what your political persuasion, it must be admitted that people trust the authorities a lot less in 2025 than they did in 2019. All right, well, any closing thoughts to tack onto that, Brian?
I don't know, black cube on Saturn, man. It's pretty interesting. I mean, whatever's going on with the UFO phenomenon, this black cube business on Saturn is wild.
Yeah. It's really interesting. That is such a bizarre discovery. I would think it would be more momentous. But our priesthood has no explanation for why there should be a massive black hexagram splashed over the North Pole of Saturn. So it just lives on as an enduring mystery, just like the placebo effect and the double slit experiment and retrocausality, all of which can be proven in peer-reviewed papers, but none of which our scientific priesthood, with their conception of reality as an objective, their conception of objective reality, they just can't deal with that. They just the science just exists in a state of unrecognized tension. And that's the state of play we're at this day and age in 2025.
All right.
Alrighty, folks. Well, I will now invite you all to visit us over at systemfailure.org. There you can get in contact with either Brian or myself by clicking on our names in the About page, or you can sign up with your email address to receive the weekly System Failure essays authored by yours truly, and receive them every Monday in your email inbox. We hope to see you all online. We'll talk to you next week.
Alrighty.